Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk about something that I really want to see Halo make a return to. The franchise's more grounded foundations. Now, when I say that Halo was once grounded, what I mean is it always felt connected in some way to the real world that we quite literally live in, which I think is something the franchise has kind of moved away from since Reach. Now, Halo was a sci-fi franchise first and foremost, with all that you'd expect to come with that genre, but it never felt unrelatable or unrealistic or too far-fetched like a lot of sci-fi does, at least for me. Almost everything that you saw and experienced felt like something that could potentially occur in our reality, and I think there were two elements that were mainly to thank for this: the visual design and the setting. Now, this video is not an art style critique or a critique of the narrative or a critique of the direction that Halo Infinite is going in or anything like that. Far, far from it. Rather, it's just something that I've been thinking about recently quite a lot mainly after replaying Halo 2 for like the 777th time. A direction that I would love to see Halo's main story or even a spin-off take the franchise in. So first, let me briefly discuss why I think recent Halo titles have kind of lacked this groundedness, if groundedness is even a word. To put it simply, I think it's a lack of focus on Earth. Earth is quite obviously something that we can all associate with as players, and having something like that core to your story, regardless of how futuristic it is, helps create that connection between the fiction and the reality. But to put it more deeply and kind of build off of this, recent Halos have focused far too much on what I personally consider to be super sci-fi. Elements that are really unrealistic and unbelievable. For example, we've only visited alien worlds and distant colonies since Reach, with the exception of Midnight, of course, in Halo 4.
There it is! No, wait!
We've not had a story set anywhere that is familiar to us. But I can hear you saying that neither did Combat Evolved, and, well, you're right. But Combat Evolved had that kind of future realism aesthetic to it to help keep it grounded even though it was set on an alien ring world. 343's new art style, however, very much had an emphasis on this super sci-fi, almost as much as their narratives and world building did. Now that's not to say that's a bad thing at all, and it's also not to say that any of this super sci-fi stuff was absent from Bungie's games because, well, that's patently false, we know that for a fact. I just think that Halo needs a dash of realism again. I'm not sure if realism is the right word, but groundedness really is the only word I can think of. Now, Infinite is grounding the franchise again in terms of its aesthetic. The art style of Halo Infinite is meant to bring the classic art style into the modern day, and the art team at 343 have done a fantastic job carrying that kind of grounded future realism aesthetic forward, while also adding to it, based on what we've seen so far. Guns are striking in their design, but aren't overly detailed and have that kind of worn black finish that makes them all look really uniform, and the primitive aesthetic of the Banished and their brute weaponry also happens to work really well with this aesthetic as well. But in the future, either beyond Halo Infinite or as a part of Halo Infinite's 10-year plan, I want to see a Halo experience take it one step further. I want to see this aesthetic carried forward into a game set on Earth once again. A game that takes us to a familiar location. And speaking of familiar locations, let's just briefly touch on what the original trilogy did so well to keep Halo grounded, even though it had so many super sci-fi elements. Like I already said, besides the visual design, which we're going to get to in a second, the main thing really was this focus on Earth. Even when you weren't fighting on Earth, she was still core to the story, almost acting like its anchor. But when you were fighting on it, it added a whole new twist to Halo's story. It drove these super sci-fi alien covenant and these super sci-fi ancient space zombies and our conflict with them home. Fighting these over-the-top and pretty unrealistic enemies in locations that actually existed was a great way to increase the severity of the mission, raise the stakes, and have us create an association with them. Staging a super sci-fi conflict in a super grounded environment allowed us to create a tangible connection with what was otherwise just realistically a far-fetched space opera story. and the visual design of the Earth environments only served to improve this. In designing Earth and her cities, Bungie went out of their way to design them in such a way that they felt at home both 500 years in the future, but also in the present day, which I think is a fantastic artistic achievement. Let's take a look at some examples. Old Mombasa was designed to look old and rather run down and reminiscent of the more ancient African architecture, and in doing so, Bungie designed a town that looks like it could literally exist today, while simultaneously not looking out of place 500 years in the future. Then, across the Great Bridge, New Mombasa contrasted really nicely with Old Mombasa. It's reminiscent of a modern high-rise city with skyscrapers that look equal parts futuristic and modern. There are still pretty regular roads littered with road signs, roundabouts, junctions, inner city gardens, national parks and the like. There's no super sci-fi floating cars or highways made out of glass and lasers or hovering skyscrapers. Just slightly more futuristic versions of their modern day counterparts, and this even extends into like the tiniest of details, like for example the crosswalks in ODST, the road barricades, and even the cat eyes that line the centre of the road. They felt futuristic enough to make you believe that this game was set 500 years in the future, but not so futuristic that they felt disconnected from reality. I think the heavy industrial roots of Bungie's designs for Earth and her cities were the primary reason for this, but that's another topic for another day. And again, this extended into Halo 3's interpretation of Voi as well. From the concrete riverside structures in the jungle, to the industrial shacks and the pipeline that ran parallel to Savo Highway, to the Traxxas warehouse and its surroundings that most of the storm takes place in. These environments felt real, not the product of an overly complicated, ultra-futuristic sci-fi aesthetic. And then, just to perfectly encapsulate this, the fact that the UNSC repurposed an old World War II base for Crow's Nest was just fantastic. Taking something that even to us now is considered pretty old, and transplanting it into a futuristic conflict with an alien hegemony created this fantastic clash of eras that, again, made sure the franchise, as crazy as it had gotten, still had a foot in reality. So, I think the answer for how we ground Halo like this again is pretty simple. A return to Earth in some capacity. Now, this doesn't have to involve like an immediate return to Earth. Obviously, we've got a whole load of stuff to deal with on Zeta Halo, and I'll be honest, I want to have a long time to explore Zeta Halo. I don't want to go rushing away from it anytime soon, but it could just be something as small as a narrative element, for example, that makes Earth core to Halo's main story again, or at least more core than just it being our homeworld and us wanting to protect it. Now, we can pretty much assume at this point that Infinite is gonna be getting story DLC of some sort somewhere down the line, so whether Halo Infinite's 10-year plan will eventually take us back to Earth at some point, or if it's done in a spin-off or something, honestly, I don't really mind. Although, I'll be honest, now that I've said that, I would really love to go to a banished, occupied Earth at some point. Seeing them, like, taking over notable locations like, I don't know, the Houses of Parliament or Milan Cathedral or something, and putting their own really brutal aesthetic on it would be really, really cool. But going back to the idea of spin-offs, there's already so many conflicts that happened on Earth that could either entirely or at least partly get a spin-off made about them. I mean, just to name a few that are on the top of my head right now, we had conflicts in Antarctica, Havana, Sydney, Arizona, and Chicago, just a few off the top of my head. There's also a slight comic version of the invasion of New Mombasa with Ben Giro from Hunt the Truth in. There's a scene in that where some dude is literally using an MP40 against the Covenant. Now, I'm not saying to put World War II guns in this hypothetical spin-off, but at the same time, the idea of using like an M1 carbine against a grunt would be kinda cool, not gonna lie. I really do think that spin-offs would be a great vector for this though. I mean, if ODST2 ever becomes a thing, then why not have an intro section based on Operation Joint Monitor, where Alpha 9 was sent into the exclusion zone in Voi where the Flood landed to clear it of all Flood threats. I mean, that is just screaming to have a Halo experience that's horror-focused made about it. I mean, what better way is there to do that than a spin-off? I think a story like this, regardless of whether it's part of Halo's main narrative or not, would be really healthy for the franchise as a whole as well. It'd help ground Halo more in reality again, while still allowing it to retain its heavy sci-fi elements, particularly those born from the Reclaimer era. Halo always had that super sci-fi flavour that modern Halo seems to have kind of tunnel-visioned on. It was always present in the universe and in its stories, but the overall focus on Earth and her cities, something that we as players can literally associate with, helped to keep the universe grounded, regardless of what crazy stuff Bungie threw at it, from alien lizards to zombie Venus flytraps to ancient wars that happened over 100,000 years ago. Regardless of all of that, the franchise still felt grounded. And further, I think having the setting of a story rooted in reality allows you to kind of push the boat out even more with the sci-fi elements, without tarnishing the atmosphere of the game or making it feel too disconnected from reality. I really think a story like this after Halo Infinite that has us fighting to save Earth again would be a breath of fresh air for Halo's narrative and could provide some really unique moments that stories in other locations in the galaxy couldn't even come close to crafting. Fighting aliens on alien worlds is one thing, but fighting them at notable landmarks on planet Earth is quite another. Like, imagine fighting the Covenant beneath a crumbling Eiffel Tower, with banshees and hornets dogfighting around the peak as a scarab tears through the heart of Paris. Imagine fighting Prometheans outside Milan Cathedral, seeing crawlers scaling the walls and fighting teleporting knights across the flying buttresses and hoping they don't knock you off. Imagine fighting the Banished outside the Houses of Parliament they converted into a Banished outpost, with the Thames being dammed to generate hydropower to fuel the outposts and forges that now litter the riverbed. Imagine fighting the Flood on Shibuya Crossing, seeing a decaying, flood-infested Tokyo from one of its most iconic locations, with combat forms rushing you from all the various alleyways. There are so many cool moments that are exclusive to a story set on Earth. A story like this could create totally novel encounters with these factions that we're all too familiar with because they're occurring in tangible locations that actually exist. Overall, what I really want at some point soon is a Halo story that takes us back home and lets us explore a 26th century Earth with all the factions and narrative elements that make Halo Halo still present. One of my favourite aspects of the original trilogy, and ODST as well, was the blend of Halo's universe and reality, and I think a return to that blend would ground Halo perfectly, while also giving us some incredible world building and set pieces along the way. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this idea. It's something that I've really been thinking about quite a lot since, well, both replaying Halo 2, and also since finding out that Anor Londo from Dark Souls was based off Milan Cathedral. That played as nicely into the Souls universe as New Mombasa and Void did with Halo for me, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about this since. So, like I already said, let me hear your thoughts on this down below in the comments, and if there's anywhere on Earth that you'd like to see a Halo game or story set, then let me hear it. And so, I'm gonna round the video out there. I want to give a massive thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual, and thank you all so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it, and I'll catch you all in the next one.